I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, on almost a daily basis now, there's something relating to ISIS, Muslim extremism, and the war and chaos in the Middle East, the human suffering in Syria and Syrian refugees, and the concern and fear gripping many Americans in the aftermath of the jihadist murderous attacks in Paris, then the 14 jihadist murders in San Bernardino, California, and scares like the one we experienced today, Tuesday, when the city of Los Angeles received what authorities believe was a credible threat of a planned terrorist attack against a public school in the LA school system, which resulted in a virtual citywide shutting down of Los Angeles public schools. And we've seen this issue seriously politicized. Donald Trump's suggestion that all foreign Muslims be temporarily banned from entering the country has been met with a deluge of criticism on the one hand, while apparently a majority of Republicans endorse his temporary ban. Other Republican candidates, almost all of whom have criticized the Trump proposal, have offered modified programs along the same lines. And while Democrats have decried proposals to limit immigration or strengthen the vetting process before issuing visas to our country, many Democrats have expressed disappointment with President Obama for what they consider to be a bland response to the terrorist murders in San Bernardino, and in general, with respect to his foreign policy vis-a-vis ISIS. And in general, the issue that currently dominates the editorial pages and television and radio talk shows is, in one form or another, the issue of Islamophobia. Are Americans becoming guilty of thinking and feeling in an Islamophobic way, blaming all Muslims for jihadist murder, and becoming afraid of any and all Muslims, including Native American Muslims? Many in the American media are saying that's exactly what America is becoming, a nation of racist bigots who are unable to distinguish between the small fringe group of extreme jihadist murderers and the vast peace-loving community of Muslims worldwide, and especially in the United States. And sadly, tragically, there are individual acts of violence and persecution of American Muslims occurring in various communities across America, and they are reprehensible, indefensible, and should be condemned by every one of us in the harshest of terms. At the same time, there are compassionate, sensitive, caring Americans and American Jews and citizens of the West in general who fear that Western nations are planting the seeds of our own social destruction by failing to appreciate the jihadist mindset and goals of the larger Muslim world. Well, one organization that's been studying the Muslim community and Islam, especially as it relates to anti-Semitism and jihad extremism, is ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And we're so pleased to have on our JBS phones once again, this time from Budapest, the founding director of ISGAP, Dr. Charles Small. Charles, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be back with you.
Charles, why are you in Budapest?
So I'm here for a two-day conference. ISGAP organized a conference with Tom Lantos Institute and the Central European University here in Budapest. And we had a two-day symposium on trying to get to find methods to measure global anti-Semitism more effectively.
Wow.
So we were with a group of about 15 professors from around Europe and North America, and we just spent 2 days trying to develop new methodologies for measuring anti-Semitism. So it was a good conference here in Budapest.
Do you find that your colleagues in Budapest are embracing of the goals of ISGAP and understand what you're trying to do?
Yeah, definitely. We had some very renowned professors from around Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe with us, and we're definitely, over the years we've developed a strong network of scholars who are like-minded and concerned about anti-Semitism, and we're trying to study it and understand it from an interdisciplinary perspective. So this was a very academic, scholarly retreat for 2 days here at the Central University in Europe, and I think we made some progress, and it was a positive conference, and we're going to continue. This group will continue meeting, and we hope to work with NGOs and Jewish organizations around the world to help them to improve their ability to measure anti-Semitism more effectively.
Well, that's
and for
wonderful.
Police and other governments to do the same.
Good for you, Mazal Tov. And again, you continue to do wonderful work, Charles. I'm very, very pleased and proud of you. So, Charles, let's tackle the issue head on. From all of your studies, from the studies of those who have spoken at ISGAP sessions, putting violence aside, how widespread throughout the Muslim world is the jihadist ideology that believes Islam should supplant Western culture?
Well, it's a reactionary social movement. It's a political movement, and I think you called it Jihadism or Islamism, and I think you're right in what you defined it. It's a term that, unfortunately, a lot of politicians in the United States refuse to utter, which is tragic, because I think it's very important to make a very strong distinction between radical political Islam or Islamism and Islam and Muslims. Muslims, the vast majority of Muslims are, regular citizens who want to live with their neighbors. Islam is a religion like many other religions with, peace-loving messages and contradictory messages like other religions have as well. But radical political Islam is a reactionary social movement which is gaining power. It's gaining power throughout much of the world, even in segments of Western Muslim populations, certainly in places like North Africa and Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Syria. Iran is run by Islamists, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, even the Turkish regime. So it's widespread. It's not a tiny minority. It's a political problem. It's a global problem, and I think we have to tackle it head on. We have to understand it, acknowledge it, and fight it. And I think, one of the things that we should remember, some of the greatest fighters against anti-Semitism that I've had the privilege to work with are Muslim intellectuals and Muslim leaders, because they know that anti-Semitism has been used against their own communities, their own societies, their own mosques and institutions, and people who claim to be liberal and politically correct refuse to denounce this. And this is the travesty. Liberal intellectuals need to speak up against radical political Islam and at the same time defend the rights of Muslim citizens in the United States and throughout the world.
You're making a distinction that's very important for our audience to hear, for all of us to hear, and understand more fully the distinction between Muslims and how many, maybe the vast majority of Muslims are, in fact, like anybody else, and they are peace-loving people. At the same time, they may go to a mosque, they may feel a certain kind of allegiance to Islam. And then there's the question of Islamic theology and ideology itself. And Charles, we speak with somebody like the Israeli expert Yoram Ettinger, and his message on JBS was to warn Americans not to be naive, and that in the vast majority of mosques throughout the world, while there may not be a call to violence, there is a fundamentalism that teaches Muslims that Allah and the religion of Islam must one day become the dominant world philosophy, replacing Western democracies. To what extent do you feel someone like Ettinger has it right? To what extent do you feel he is overstating the issue?
Right. So I didn't hear Edinger's comments, so I don't want to speak to something I didn't hear, and I don't have the time to assess. But I would say that, first of all, we should take a step back. Terrorism is psychological warfare, and we really have to take a step back and not allow these horrific attacks to terrorize us. We have to try to kind of calm down. It's more dangerous to drive, for example, from Connecticut into Manhattan on the 95. It's more dangerous statistically than, people have a greater chance to be harmed in a traffic accident on the 95 highway than being hurt in a terror attack. Actually, the odds are much greater that you'll be hurt in a car accident than in a terror attack. So we should really kind of take a step back and not allow the terrorists to terrorize us, because if we're terrorized, we're going to win. The terrorists will win. Having said that, radical political Islam does not believe in equality. It doesn't believe that everybody has the right to be equal citizens under one law, that Jews or Christians or women or gay people or Yazdis or Baha'is can be equal to a religious Muslim man. And they believe in a hierarchy. So if we are citizens who want to live in an American democracy or believe in democratic values, radical Islamist, jihadist ideology is a problem. They do want to destroy democratic principles and replace democracy with a Sharia-led caliphate or a space where Islamic law will reign. And if Islamic law dominates, then we can't be equal to Muslims. This is a problem for anybody who believes in equality and citizenship and democratic principles. So there is a clash of ideologies happening.
I appreciate the way you talk about how you don't want Americans to give in to a terrorist mentality where they are terrorized and fear, and that the reality is that one is more likely to have an accident or be a casualty, even to die on the American highway, than from a terrorist attack. I don't think that will ever persuade anybody, Charles. The same thing is said about flying. If people are afraid of flying, they're afraid of flying, and their answer is, I could be in a car accident and walk away. Very few people walk away from a plane accident. So that although I understand my chance of being in an accident are higher on the highway, I still am afraid of flying. There are people who would say that. And the problem here is that in a terrorist attack, the chances of your walking away are less than if you're in a car accident. And at the moment, you are correct. There is a fear that is gripping. By the way, when I say gripping, it's on the edges at the moment. If there were 2 or 3 more of the same incidents that we saw in California, Charles, I think Americans would be very, very frightened for themselves and for their children. But I understand your words of caution. I didn't hear you, however, speak directly to my question. My question is, to what extent is the ideology of the supremacy of Islam, and whether it's jihad with violence or jihad over time without violence, if I go to an average typical mosque anywhere in the world, or if I go to a typical mosque in the United States, what's the ideology being preached in that mosque, and to what extent is the attitude of Islam must one day supplant Western thinking and Western culture and even Western democracy? To what extent is that a teaching that you believe is throughout the Muslim world, as opposed to jihadist terrorist violence, which may be in a more narrow sector of the Islamic community?
Right. So I think that we have to, speak truthfully. I think when we look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was created about 100 years ago as a reaction to British colonialism, they fused European anti-Semitism with a very reactionary form of Islam, and this sort of reactionary movement was born, and this is the root of the problem, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the root of the problem sort of gave birth to Wahhabism. It created Hamas. It even Ayatollah Khomeini and the Shiite community, the Iranian revolutionary regime, is embedded to the ideology of the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood. So I think when Western governments, for example, engage the Muslim Brotherhood, when Western governments do business with the Iranian revolutionary regime and will be transferring tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to the Iranian revolutionary regime's economy, which is controlled by the sort of vicious police force, civilian police force in the society, that we are not only strengthening these movements, we're weakening our allies, we're weakening moderates, and we should also realize that ideologically, if we in the United States can do business with the Iranian revolutionary regime, what do young people think in the suburbs of Paris, young Muslims in the suburbs of Paris, or young men who are marginalized from the economies of European cities or even American cities when they go to the mosque? And I think what we have mistakenly done in the past decades, it's not just the Obama administration, it's other administrations in the United States and other Western governments, by doing business with regimes that are genocidal in their anti-Semitism, sexist, anti-Christian, anti-moderate Muslim, we are giving oxygen to this movement around the world. And I think we must stop doing this, and we must work with and strengthen the majority of moderate Muslims who are tragically the real victims of this terrorist reactionary social movement. In Syria, we have 300,000 massacred people. We have 8 million refugees. This is just from Syria. Syria has imploded and perhaps doesn't even really exist any longer. Similar to Iraq. Similar things are happening in Libya. And this is going on around the world. Boko Haram in West Africa, this reactionary social movement, killing girls whose parents send them to become literate, because in this twisted vision of religion, a girl becoming literate is against Islam. So Boko Haram, the forbidden book, they go and kill school children. Mm-hmm. And we in the West have engaged this and tried to appease them. And we know from history that you can't appease these reactionary movements. We have to confront it, and we have to name it, and we have to deal with it, and we have to help and protect the victims of this reactionary movement who are Muslim. And for some reason, in the sort of the upside-down political discourse of the United States, if we condemn this reactionary political movement, somehow people are labeled as Islamophobic. And they protect the extremists rather than the moderates who just want to get on with their lives, who are the victims of this fascistic movement. Mm-hmm. So we have to name the problem and come to terms with it. And I think in a sort of postmodern moment, people who claim to be liberal have been silenced. Mm-hmm. And it's time for liberals, it's time for the human rights activists, the United States, the intellectuals, the media of record, to make positions known, to take strong positions against this fascistic ideology, and to speak out against it clearly. And this is not Islamophobic, it's on the contrary, it's pro-Islam. We have to protect the vast majority of moderates against this horrific, violent movement.
Mm-hmm. Charles, today Saudi Arabia announced it has created a coalition of 34 Muslim nations, predominantly Muslim nations, to fight terrorism. And the coalition includes, by the way, the Palestinians. What's your sense of this new coalition?
Well, I think, we say, and those of us who study anti-Semitism, and we know it from history, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews.
Yes.
These anti-Semitic movements, this Wahhabist Islam, which actually the Saudis own the vast majority of mortgages on mosques in the United States, the majority of them are actually owned by Saudi interests, imagine. So, these are, I don't understand how, and I don't know if it's possible for anti-Semitic, reactionary, sexist regimes to defend democratic principles. Uh-huh. If they help to stop ISIS and the violence, wonderful. But there's a deeper problem that we also have to address, and this goes deep to our foreign policy and many of our interests in the world. And I think we need to take a step back and take stock of where we are and where we're going.
Okay. Look, Charles, you're a liberal Jew from Canada. What's your view of the immigration controversy raging throughout the United States, with suggestions that the United States should only permit Muslims into America who can be vetted in such a way that there's no question that they are not a threat to America, they are not jihadists? What's your view of what American policy should be now on this immigration issue?
Well, it's a complicated story. On the one hand, in the last 7 years, according to the New York Times, there's been 60 million more refugees created in the world. 60 million. 8 million from Syria. So at one level, the context of the American debate of whether we should take in 10,000 or less is really a drop in the bucket for the most powerful country in the world. So the context of our debate, I think, is very narrow. Having said that, of course, the United States and any society must defend its citizens. So people coming to our country, of course, need to be screened adequately, and that goes without saying. And all immigration and refugees should be screened. And I also think that under international law, everybody has the right to declare refugee status in the country that they arrive in. So a lot of these refugees are arriving in Turkey. So Turkey actually has a legal obligation to give these people a fair hearing and determine whether they're true refugees or not. If they are refugees, they have a right to stay in Turkey. So for them to travel to other countries is not legally valid by international law. If other countries decide to take them for humanitarian reasons, that's important and that's wonderful, but they're not. It's my understanding that these countries are not legally obligated to do it. And having said that, I think the United States, Western North America, and the Americas were built on refugees and immigrant ways of immigration, and we should certainly, I think, take a very humanitarian view of the situation. There's minorities and moderate, decent people whose lives have been ripped apart by years of war, a horrific war. And I think that the world has to address the systemic causes of this war, which we also played a role in sitting idly by to allow this to get to the situation that it has. Don't forget, red lines have been crossed many, many, many times. So I think we have an obligation to deal with this and to take in people who need help. And I would also, say that there's military options to create no-fly zones, to perhaps settle people temporarily in parts of Syria that would come under protection from a coalition that would stem the flow of refugees. That would actually, I'm sure most Syrians would like to stay in their home country and not go around the world to a different place. So to help people stay in their country while the war hopefully is settled soon.
All right. It may be that because you're out of the country at the moment, you're not as sensitive to the raging debate here at home. And we're taping right now. There is a Republican presidential pre-debate among the lesser candidates, and then tonight the Republicans will be debating on CNN. And the big issue here is, Donald Trump suggests that America change its immigration policy with respect to Muslims. And there are many Americans who are now saying, we have no obligation to accept immigrants into this country if we can't be sure they are safe. They argue, we want the means to vet them properly. And how do you vet a Syrian refugee? And therefore, the argument is not against immigration to the United States, but that there should be some kind of temporary hold on the process so that immigrants coming in who might be part of a terrorist cell or terrorists have infiltrated Syrian refugee groups, they should not be allowed in the country. And that was I was asking you. I was asking you, what do you believe immigration policy should be in Western countries? How much do Western countries have a right to impose harsher restrictions on Muslims coming in from countries where there is a pocket of jihadist violence?
Right. So first of all, I think what Donald Trump is doing and the National Front in France and other reactionary movements in the West is trying to capitalize on the fear that's been generated by this terrorism and the wars in the Middle East and so forth. But I actually would place the vast majority of the blame on this situation on the silence of liberal policymakers and the media of record. The political correctness, our inability to name the problem, to name radical political Islam, to speak about anti-Semitism, to speak about, when the deal with Iran was just signed and President Obama went to the American university and he boldly said that this agreement has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or human rights. I've never seen a leader, a president of the United States say such things before in my life, and I hope I'll never have to ever see that again in my life. The issue is we need to confront this reactionary social movement, and the silence of the human rights community, the traditional liberal community in the United States, the intellectuals, the media, and the policymakers has left such a huge vacuum that characters like Donald Trump will play on the fears of Americans, and the more outrageous he becomes, the more popular he is, because the more popular he is, the more silent the decent leaders have become. So I think the leaders in the moderate Republican and Democratic parties really need to speak to this crisis in a very responsible but in a very clear way. And we have not had the leadership. And the vacuum that this has created, I think, is dangerous for even the political stability in the United States. But this vacuum is very dangerous. And it's unfortunate to see the level of political discourse get to this moment where people are using fear and forms of prejudice and discrimination for political gain. And it's sad to see how low we've sunken.
Charles, it's always wonderful to speak with you. As I said at the beginning, you're doing fabulous work. Congratulations to ISGAP for the work you're doing now in Hungary. I wish that is really a successful operation. And then you go on to Israel, I know, from there. And then after the new year, you're back in the United States, and I expect to see you in person as soon as I possibly can. But have a wonderful end to this calendar year, and I hope 2016 is a very healthy, wonderful one for you.
For you, too, and to all the listeners, good holidays, happy Hanukkah, and a New Year to everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Be well, Charles. The thoughts of Charles Small, director of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. So much of what he says is so important for us to hear. I am only speaking for myself. I wish in the media I heard less about people being criticized for being opportunists who play on fear of others. And I believe that ultimately you just report what's being done or what's being said. Let the viewer decide. There are people who hear Charles Small and say, oh, Charles, you're playing on the fear of people when you talk about Islamic jihadism the way you are. And I know Charles doesn't mean to use anybody's fear. You may disagree with Donald Trump 100%, but the issue is substantive, not what's his motivation. In any case, as always, I appreciate Charles being on and hope this has helped you as you understand the issue in a broader sense. And my thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.